So a priest and a rabbi are across the street from each other. They're good friends, and the priest can never get a break. He has nobody to replace him when it comes to confessional. Everything else he can get covered, but not confessional. So he asks his friend the rabbi, "Can you cover me for me?" The rabbi says, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'll sit in a couple times." So they sit in together. First parishioner comes, "Father, forgive me, I have sinned." "What's your sin, my daughter?" "I've committed adultery." "And how many times did you do it?" 3 times. "Put $5 in the charity box and go and sin no more." Second parishioner comes, "Father, I have sinned." "And what's your sin, my son?" "Father, I've committed adultery." "How many times have you done it?" 3 times. "Put $5 in the charity box and go and sin no more." Rabbi says, "I got this. Piece of cake. Go gegas into hay. Be well. Have a good trip." Parishioner comes in, says, "Father, I have sinned." "What's your sin, my daughter?" "Father, I've committed adultery." "And how many times have you done it?" Says the rabbi. "Only once." "Only once? Well, you're in luck. This week we're running a special, 3 for $5. All right, no rabbi is going to ever say this, and it is a sin, and there's lots of sins. There's many sins to choose from, and that's what we're doing tonight. We're choosing from amongst many, many sins. But the point is, we all sin, and we all carry different types of sins in our lives, in our hearts, and we need to confess. We need confessional. I love confessional. I've never tried it, but I love the idea of it, and I think the Catholics have it right. We're not going to have any confessional booths at Shurat Hayam. It's not going to be part of Cineplex, don't worry, but we do have Yom Kippur. I mean, that's what today is. It's one long confessional booth, and you don't talk to me about your sins or your neighbor about your sins. That's your business. You talk to God, because we all have sins. There are only really 2 types of sins, however. As complicated as it all is, there's sins of commission, the things we've done that we should not have done, the things we've said that we should not have said. And as painful as they are, and they are painful, at least you know them when you've done them. You know them when you see them. You know them because they're a sin. It's the other type of sin that's harder, that's at least more difficult to locate. They're called sins of omission. So what's a sin of omission? Once in Sunday school, a teacher asked this to her class. "Does anyone here know what I mean by sin of omission?" Little girl in the back replied, "I do, I do." "Aren't those all of the sins that we should have committed, but we didn't?" No. What happens in Vegas does not stay in Vegas. We shouldn't think about all of those moments that we missed opportunities, regardless of whether God sees them. We see them, and we carry them with us everywhere we go, and we bring them to Yom Kippur, and we dump them in the front of God to make atonement, to become at one with ourselves. But there are many types of sins, and this type of sin is very difficult and painful. The sin of omission, the things we should have done but we didn't do, and the things that we should have said but we didn't say. Silence can be holy, and it can be a very beautiful, holy thing to sit in silent meditation, to sit in silence during the Amidah, but silence can also be a sin. When we are cowardly silent, when we are callously silent, when we are cruelly silent, the Talmud says, shtika kehoda'ah, silence is like consent. Silence can be holy, but silence can also be a sin. As my teacher, Rabbi Brad Artson, once said, in the midst of this current dark age, we need to remember our eternal calling to sanctify God in the midst of the people. How? By feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and healing the sick and pursuing peace and identifying with the weak. When we move from silence to eloquence, we give God a hand in this world. We give God a voice. Shtika kehoda'ah. There is no neutrality. Silence is consent. And we are all guilty of sins of commission. Al chet shechatani lefanecha. Forgive us for the things we should not have said, and forgive us for the things we should not have done. But we are also all guilty of the sins of omission. Forgive us, God, for the things that we should have said. Forgive us for the things we should have done. Now, on Rosh Hashanah, I spoke about tikkun nefesh, fixing ourselves, the individual self, and it's an important place to start. But as Jews, we begin with the self, and we move out into the world. We fix ourselves, tikkun nefesh, and then we do tikkun olam. We go out and fix the world. And what better place to start in the world than the World Olympics, than the Olympics of 2012 that we just finished up? because they were amazing. And I love the Olympics. I'm sure many of you do as well. Excuse me, I need some water. Can somebody give me water? Just kidding. So the Olympics, just 24 more hours. The Olympics were off to a terrible start. Why? Because there was something glaringly absent amidst the speeches and the dancing and the music. What was missing? It was the 40th anniversary of the Munich massacre. In 1972, you all know the Munich Olympics, when 11 Israeli athletes and a German security guard, it's important not to remember him, were killed, were murdered by Black September, Palestinian terrorists. While they were sleeping, while they were preparing for the next day's games, they were killed, and there was silence on the 40th anniversary. The only atrocity of this type ever in Olympic history, ever. And they couldn't spare 60 seconds for a memorial, a moment of silence, something. 40 years have gone by, and every 4 years, the families of the slain athletes petition, thinking this would be the year. Well, they thought this would be the year, as one of them wrote to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. We asked for a minute of silence, or some commemoration, because it was natural in our eyes. But they told us very clearly, there are 21 Arab delegations that will leave if we say something about Israeli athletes. There was a commemoration, as Leonard Green in the New York Post wrote. The martyrs were remembered this week during a London ceremony, filled with sadness, filled with reflection, but not a peep about them has been said publicly on the one place where it counts, at the Summer Games on Olympic soil. The only atrocity of this kind in the history of the Olympics, and they couldn't spare 60 seconds of silence. Take it out of badminton qualifying matches for all we care, right? Take it out of race walking preliminary rounds. Take it out of men's trampoline. Grown men doing trampoline as a sport. We could have been spared 60 seconds of that, but it wasn't about timing, was it? It was a much deeper issue. And it was because IOC President Jacques Rogue said it all. We feel that the opening ceremony is an atmosphere not fit to remember such a tragic accident. To which he got a thank you letter from the Palestinian Authority head, Jabril Rajoub, head of the PA's Olympic Committee. Thank you. Because sport is a bridge of love, unification, spreading peace among nations. It must not be a cause for divisiveness and for spreading of racism. 11 Israeli athletes murdered, and you're going to call it a tragic accident. 11 Israeli athletes murdered, right, at the Olympic Games of all places, and you want to talk about bridges of love? 11 Israeli athletes ripped away from their loved ones in this life, and you want to talk about divisiveness? 11 Israeli athletes murdered for one reason, because they were Israelis, because they were Jews. You want to talk about racism? Racism is alive and well in this world. It is called anti-Semitism. It is called anti-Zionism. Anti-Semitism, thinly veiled as anti-Zionism, is spreading across the world. Whether the IOC meant it or not, they were still guilty of a sin of commission. And whether we meant it or not, the Olympians that watched, the viewers that watched, those of us who didn't sign the petition, 100,000 signatures on a petition with Barack Obama himself on the petition, if we didn't do anything or say anything, whether we meant it or not, shtika kehoda'ah, silence is consent. And when it comes to Israel, there is too much silence when they are hung out in the wind to dry. How about the Goldstone Report? Remember the Goldstone Report in 2009? Richard Goldstone, unfortunately a Jew, was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to look into the previous year, in 2008, the Gaza incident when there was a war, right? And they were back and forth, and there was uncertainty as to what happened. So the UN Council looks into it. Goldstone and his comrades, the UN, took 575 pages to denounce Israel for deliberately, disproportionately attacking and humiliating and terrorizing a civilian population. Israeli soldiers should be held criminally liable for prosecution in international courts. That's what they wrote. You want to know how condemning this was? Hamas endorsed this report. The world media picked it up and reported it ad nauseum. Some U.S. politicians signed their name onto it. Israel was judged and tried and sentenced and hung in the court of world opinion, giving more anti-Zionists and more anti-Semites unneeded fuel. Now, fast forward to a little over a year ago. Richard Goldstone retracted his findings. Richard Goldstone didn't do it in 575 pages. He did it in an op-ed piece to the Washington Post. Quote, "If I had known then what I know now, my report would have been a very different document indeed." Turns out Israel didn't deliberately target innocents. Turns out its military courts have been and will continue to investigate appropriately the rare cases in which civilians are targeted, never targeted, when they are hurt, when they are killed. That's what happens, unfortunately, in wars. But they're looking into it and they're investigating themselves. The very things that he says in his op-ed piece, the Hamas has failed to do. The only difference between Hamas and Israel is that Hamas has done these things and Israel has not. Hamas has aimed their missiles and fired them on Israeli cities, thousands upon thousands of missiles being fired, and they are unaccused. The world sits in silence. The UN sits in silence. The press sits in silence. I bet many of you didn't even know about the Goldstone retraction until this moment in time. That's how deafening the silence around Israel has become. But this is a pattern. Accuse Israel of heinous crimes. Right? Have the accusations legitimized, like tonight in the UN and kangaroo courts and biased press, and then retract the allegations, and silence is consent. Just like in 2000, I have so many examples here. Just like in 2000, I was living in Israel, and Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, and supposedly, that's what sparked the second intifada. That's what the world press said. And then later Hezbollah or Hamas said, no, it was actually all a pretext. We were looking to go to war. Didn't matter. The damage was done. Israel was accused. Just like in 2002, the Jenin massacre. Remember the Jenin massacre? Israel went into the Jenin refugee camp because they were firing missiles out of the camp. Instead of carpet bombing the place, they went door to door. And in the process, hundreds and thousands of civilians and children were slaughtered, according to Palestinian official reports. Maybe you saw some of these pictures on the internet of IDF savagery. And then, when cooler heads prevailed, what they find? Not thousands of civilians killed, not hundreds of individuals, 52 mostly Palestinian gunmen. Reports were fabricated, pictures were doctored, libel was spread, and we, the world, sat in silence as the damage was done. Shtika k'hoda'ah. Silence is consent. A couple years ago, I spoke about the flotilla incident when Israel boarded that inbound ship coming from Turkey, and they were accused of violating international law. And then, after the uproar, most of the world said they were well within their rights, and every civilized country would have done exactly the same. The damage was done, the libel was spread, Israel was hung out to dry. Just like in 2009, the Durban Anti-Zionism Conference is what it amounted to. That's where we first heard the term apartheid state when it came to Israel, and they've been using this term apartheid state ever since. Have you been to Israel? It is the farthest thing from an apartheid state in that part of the world, in any part of the world. It doesn't matter. The facts don't matter, right? Accusations abound, and we sit in silence. Silence is consent. Just like the fence, the illegal fence that the world was in an uproar over. Prior to the fence being put in, 19,000 terrorist attempts. And now, virtually none. Prior to the fence, 1,000 Israeli civilians were killed, and now out of those same territories, virtually none. Since the fence has been erected, International Court of Justice says Israel is well within its rights to erect a fence to keep terrorists out. And just like the new blood libel that is going on, the one that is spreading across the Middle East as we speak. You know that ridiculous 14-minute video, that anti-Muslim video? Of course, who made it? The Jews, a Jew in LA, an Israeli Jew named Sam Basile. And how did he make it? He got 100 wealthy Jews, because we're all wealthy according to the outside world, and we financed it. And why did we finance it? We financed it for the state of Israel. Well, that's what the media reported just up until a couple days ago. You probably read this. I read this. The world read this. The Jews in Israel were responsible for the murderous rampage taking place in the Middle East and around the world. And then, what happens? Oh, we find out there is no man named Sam Basile. There was a man involved with this who was involved with the production, a Coptic Egyptian. Jews had nothing to do with it. Israel had nothing to do with it. Those are the facts, but the facts don't matter because the world is silence. Silence is deafening. Silence is a sin. Shtika kahoda'ah. To sit in silence is to sit with consent. My friends, now more than ever before, we cannot afford as Jews, Americans, and human beings to be silent, not with what's taking place right now in the UN, with this madman, Ahmadinejad, is speaking to the UN. I'm just lifting 2 quotes off of his website. The Zionist regime of Israel faces a dead end and will, under God's grace, be quote-unquote wiped off of the map. And the Zionist regime is a usurper, a cancerous tumor that should be eradicated. We can have no doubts about who this man is, what he stands for, and what he and his other cronies want to do. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when they get nuclear weapons. And that's the conversation we need to have right now, once and for all. I have never used this pulpit as a bully pulpit. I have never used it for politics, and I'm not using it for politics now. I'm speaking to you as a rabbi, as a Jewish leader, and as a Jew. This is not political. Iran must never be allowed to create nuclear weapons, period. Diplomacy? Yes. We want diplomacy. It's the ideal. Sanctions? Absolutely, if they work. But here are the words of Alan Dershowitz. Although I support President Obama's policy with regard to the Iranian nuclear threat, I think we must take it one step further if a combination of diplomacy and sanctions are ever to work. God willing, they will. That step is to communicate to Iran unequivocally and without any room for misunderstanding that the Obama administration will never allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. President Obama has already made this point, and he has, to his credit, but not in the way that the Iranians obviously understand or believe. Language matters, says Dershowitz, and the president must now use language that commits him in the eyes of the Iranians to keep his promise that if necessary, he will use military force to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is not a liberal or conservative issue. This is not an Obama versus Romney issue. This is not a Jewish versus non-Jewish issue. This is not a peacenik versus warmonger issue. This is an issue for all of us who love Israel, who love America, who love decency and justice, and yes, all of us who love peace. We must draw a red line not to be crossed by Iran. We must hold it and respond to it with military action if necessary. We must do whatever it takes to keep Iran from securing, from creating nuclear weapons. That, my friends, is what we have to do. In the words of Edmund Burke, all that is required for evil to prevail in this world is for good men and good women to do nothing. Shtika kahoda'ah. Silence is consent. This is not about Israel, and this is not about Jews. We are not the only ones being persecuted around the world. There's so much blood being shed. There are so many victims who need a voice. There is so much silence to shatter, and that's what we need to do in this world. This past summer, as you all witnessed, as I did, the Sikh massacre in Wisconsin, where Sikhs, our brothers and sisters, fellow Americans, were in their temple praying to God, and they were murdered, horribly murdered, amidst prayer, as if it's ever okay, but amidst prayer in their holy sanctuary. How many of us gathered in support, in solidarity with our Sikh brothers? How many went and wrote or visited a Sikh temple to stand with our Sikh sisters? I didn't. I'm guilty of this too. I didn't write any letters publicly outcrying, decrying the acts of terror against them. Right? I stood in silence along with so many of us, of so many of you. How many of us even knew about the mosque 2 weeks ago? in Harrisonburg, Virginia, that was vandalized. Cars' windows were smashed. Slurs and epithets on the walls of a mosque that said, "This is America, go home." We can't allow this to happen to any American. Doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what their house of worship is about. We can't allow fanaticism and evil to rear its ugly head in this world and not do anything and not say anything. When ultra-Orthodox Jews throw stones at young girls because their ankles are exposed, we must speak out against this horrible, horrible crime. When Tibetan monks immolate themselves, set themselves on fire to protest China's occupation of Tibet, I'm sorry, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is wrong on this. It's not a political issue. You have to speak up. You have to speak out, shtika hoda'ah, because silence is consent. And right now, as people are being murdered in the Middle East, as a United States ambassador and 3 others in the Libyan embassy, and other embassies are being rioted upon, and there are riots, and dozens upon dozens of innocent people have been murdered over this idiotic 14-minute anti-Muslim trailer, right? It's just ridiculous trailer if you've seen it. But regardless of the fact, who murders when they are insulted? Right? When is it okay, if you're offended, to riot and cause terror around the world? I'm sorry. Even if you are offended, no mature human being murders another person because of an offense. No decent man or woman murders when they're insulted. Responsible religions do not condone terror, and when it happens, as it happens in our religions, they should be held accountable to speak up, to speak out, just like we would to Jews doing something like this. Just like Christian would against Christians, Muslims must be expected to speak up and speak out and stand with us and say never again. We should stop apologizing for these moments in time when people are murdered. Our U.S. ambassador is the one and his family who needs an apology. We didn't create this video. It is not our responsibility to apologize for it. Islamic violence cannot be rationalized. It must be stopped, because the world is silent and we are not speaking up and we are not speaking out. This is not an anti-Muslim sermon. This is a pro-decency, pro-truth, pro-justice sermon. If Jews did it, if Christians did it, if Hindus did it, then we'd speak up and we'd yell at them. But right now it's being done in the name of Islam, and it must be put to an end. Abraham Lincoln said, "To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards of women and men." We are scared into silence when it comes to Islamic terror, and it is time to take a stand and to speak up and to speak out wherever terror rears its ugly head by whomever is doing it. For whatever reason, there is no justification for innocent blood being spilled. And that's our duty as jobs, to live out the words of our Torah. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. You shall not stand idly by the bloodshed of your fellow man. Shtika hoda'ah, because silence is consent. Now I know it's overwhelming. I know we have no idea where to start, but we have to start somewhere. We have to do something. The Mishnah says, Hu alecha, Hu omer, lo alecha hamelacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin levatel mamena. You are not expected to do everything, but we are all expected to do something, to try something, to say something, to speak out, to live out the words in the Psalms. Lo hametim, Yahallelujah, velo kol yodei duma. The dead cannot praise you, and neither can those who go down in silence. Maybe we won't win. Maybe we won't battle back all the evil, but at least we can do something. At least we can say something. At least we can commit to never again going down in silence. Shtika koda'ah, because silence is consent. But there is hope, and I would never leave you without hope. And there is great hope. And I'm going to start with a man named Bullock. Bullock was a Polish typesetter in Nazi Germany. And Bullock took in a Jewish man and a Jewish woman to hide them. He took in Marcel Reich-Rhein, a famous literary critic. I heard this from Rabbi David Wolpe. And Marcel Rhein wrote about it in his autobiography. Ryan could never understand why Bullock, this average ordinary guy, this average ordinary non-Jew, would risk his life and his family's life to harbor these two Jews. So one night Bullock got drunk, and he asked him, he says, I have to know, why are you doing this? Why are you saving us? To which Bullock said, the most powerful man in the land, Hitler, says you two Jews should die. I, Bullock, a lowly typesetter, say you two Jews should live. Now let's see who wins. And Hitler was killed, and Ryan lived, and Bullock won, and that gives me hope. Because there were Bullocks then, and we have our own version of the lowly typesetter Bullock. Although she's not lowly, she's regal and grand and powerful. Her name is Reverend Dee Dee Coleman. And if you haven't heard Reverend Dee Dee Coleman speak, she makes me look like I'm drinking decaf coffee, right? This woman is filled with this Spirit of God. This woman came into this room and preached on behalf of Israel. This is a Christian minister who once had a tepid relationship with Israel, and then she went to Israel, and then she started studying about Israel, and then she saw this pattern, and now she speaks the truth, and she's out there doing the work of God, shattering the silence. Believe you me, Reverend Coleman will not go down in silence. And then there's another man I was introduced to. I haven't met him, but I look forward to it. Andrew and Bob Walker introduced me to Joe Esterhaus. Joe Esterhaus, you probably don't know his name, but you know his movies. He's a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he's written many movies, one of which was Flashdance, another was Basic Instinct. I mean, he's a well-known writer. He also had a father, as do we all, but his father was, Esterhaus is non-Jewish, and his father was a Nazi collaborator. Joe didn't know this, though, growing up. He only found out later in life that his father was a Nazi collaborator, and once he found out this, he denounced his father. The two never spoke again. He wouldn't be part of it. And so it makes sense that later in life, he was introduced to Mel Gibson. Right? Mel Gibson, a well-known anti-Semite. Mel Gibson wrote The Passion of the Christ, and after The Passion of the Christ, he wanted to do a mea culpa. I'm sorry, reach out to the Jews. Do you remember this? He wanted to make a Maccabee story, turn the Hanukkah story into the quote-unquote Jewish Braveheart. So he hired Joe Esterhaus, and Joe Esterhaus, a good man, wrote the Jewish Braveheart, and he handed it back to Mel Gibson, and Gibson would have none of it, because Gibson didn't want to tell the truth. Gibson wanted to use this as a propaganda piece. Gibson wanted an anti-Semitic storyline. Gibson wanted to berate and belittle the Jews. And so he told Esterhaus, you better rewrite this. And Esterhaus wouldn't rewrite it. Esterhaus would have no part of it, and Gibson buried the script. You will never see the script. But hopefully we'll meet Joe Esterhaus, because he'll come here and speak. He's documented all of this in his book, Heaven and Mel. And it's a truthful story about an anti-Semite who needs the truth to be told. Joe Esterhaus is a man who stands with decency and goodness and the Jews, and Joe Esterhaus will not go down in silence. And that brings us full circle and to a conclusion, but not before we give the 11 Israeli athletes their due. Because there was gold medal earned at the Olympic Games, but I read about Ali Reisman in an article that said she earned gold medal, M-E-T-T-L-E. She had a heart of gold. She had a spirit of gold, and that's exactly what she won for those 11 Israeli athletes. Ali Reisman surprised the world. How? By winning gold, by doing it to Hava Nagila of all songs, and then boldly and courageously dedicating her gold to those 11 Israeli athletes who were murdered well before she was born. One soldier wrote her a letter, an IDF soldier, because he was on an army base, and some of you have read this letter. I'm only reading a part of it. And he and his comrades were at the IDF army base in the workout room, working out in the gym, and he said the following. Ali, you picked a song for your floor routine in the Olympics that every Jewish kid knows. It's that song that drew almost every one of us at the Israeli army base gym to the television, just as soon as reports about you came on the news. After showing your floor exercise to Hava Nagila, the announcer told about your gold medal with unmasked pride, and of your decision to dedicate it to the 11 slain athletes in the Munich Olympics of 1972. There's some tough people in that gym that day, Allie. You probably understand that words like bravery and heroism carry a lot of weight with this bunch. But that's what they called you as they gave you a standing ovation. There was nothing apologetic about what you did, Allie. For so long, we've had to apologize for who we are, for how we dress, for our beliefs, for the way we look. It seems like the IOC wanted to keep that tradition. Quiet, Jews. Keep your tragedy on the sidelines. Don't disturb our party. But they didn't count on a young girl, a young 18-year-old girl in a leotard. Thank you for standing up against an injustice that was done to our people. As I was walking back to my machine at the gym, I caught one of the officers give a long salute to your image on the television screen, and I think that says it all. My friends, this is Kol Nidrei, shtika kehoda'ah. Silence is consent. We are here to confess the things we have done and the things we have said and the things that we have not done and the things that we have not said. Yom Kippur calls us to stand up against anti-Zionism like Reverend Didi Coleman. And Yom Kippur calls us to stand up against anti-Semitism like Joe Esterhaus. And Yom Kippur calls upon all of us to stand up against injustice, as did Ali Reisman. Tonight begins Yom Kippur, where we say the dead cannot praise you, and neither can those who go down in silence. We are not dead. We are still here. There is still time. We can do teshuvah, return, and do our part. Tonight, each of us must vow to do something. Tonight, each of us must commit to say something. Right? We must support Israel Bonds. We must support AIPAC. We must support the ADL. The ADL, one of the finest organizations I know. If you want to get involved and lend your voice and give voice to those who have none. So come join me in a couple weeks as we support Rob Mazo and Rhonda Gilberg, and we honor them. And I'm also getting an award. But come honor them as we make a stand together, because it is time to shatter the silence. Whatever organization you choose, just choose an organization. Find a cause to support that fights evil, that gives a voice to victims with none. Tonight, we must resolve to say not only never again, but to mean it. And let me end with the words of Bullock. The most powerful man in the land says, you Jews should live. I, Bullock, a lowly typesetter, says, you two Jews will live. He said, you'll die. I'll say you'll live. Now let's see who wins. I will not go down in silence. I know you will not go down in silence. I know we will not go down in silence. Shtika kehoda'ah. Silence is consent. So now, let's see who wins. And now, let's honor the 11 Israeli athletes as we all rise and we give them their 60 seconds of due as we sing out, as we sing loud, as we sing proud, words of hope, words that will remind this world that never again will we go down in silence, never again will we stand idly by bloodshed, never again, because we have Hatikva. The words are on your page.